Neither of these are traditional trail mountain bikes. This is the new Forbidden Druid V2. Has 130mm rear suspension travel, but any relation to a normal trail bike stops there. It's a dream bike for many, but how does it stack up against another, even more futuristic trail bike? I'm going to show you the difference between this extreme £7,000 MTB and the ultra-modern stealth Genius 910 ST from Scott to find out which of these two very different bikes is the trail bike of the future. Trail bikes typically have 29-inch wheels, 130mm of travel, and are the jack of all trades in the mountain bike world, offering the most versatility of any MTB, as comfortable going up, down, and along. If you want to learn more about trail bikes first, click the link here. But in the meantime, let's dive into the details of these two incredibly futuristic mountain bikes. This looks wild. Okay, that's a high pivot suspension system with an idler, and these are two different size wheels, not what you would expect to find on a traditional trail bike. It's called the Forbidden Druid V2, and it costs £6,999 or $6,899 US for the GX AXS RS Plus build. That's a mouthful. What do all those letters mean? Well, this is the mid-spec build you can get on a Druid V2 with the cheapest GX level wireless electronic gears by SRAM, which use lower grade materials than their more expensive models. And the RS Plus means it comes with a mid-range RockShox Select Plus suspension. There are a host of high-performing, great value parts on this build, and the spec isn't full of pointless glips, but it's £7,000. So why does it cost so much, even though it's only mid-spec? That's because at the heart of this bike is this amazing frame, which all of the mid-spec components bolt onto, and is very special. Which it should be, as the frame alone retails for a whopping £3,599 or $3,799 US. It's made from carbon fibre with stainless steel and aluminium bolts throughout, and it's tailored for your height in each size. As it gets a different rear centre length, the chainstays grow proportionally to match the front end. It's also packed with high-tech suspension. It's got a high pivot layout with an idler wheel and an upside-down 4-bar link system to improve braking performance over the outgoing single pivot model. Canadian company Forbidden clearly thinks that this is the recipe for success with a trail bike. But why? Well, the high pivot suspension system makes a unique rearward axle path all the way through the range of the rear suspension's travel. This means that the wheel can move backwards away from the bumps and should mean that it can carry great speed on rough terrain. The 4-bar suspension system isolates the suspension from braking forces and should mean more traction to the rear wheel when you're hanging on the anchors. The obvious downside to an idler is added drag, and the high pivot design can feel odd to riders who are used to a more conventional suspension system, especially when compressing the suspension under G-force in jumps and corners. Does all this add up to the trail bike of the future? Well, let's find out by taking it for a ride. Okay, you're on board with me riding the Forbidden Druid V2. Now, it climbs really well, especially considering it's a mullet and it's not the lightest, and it's got an idler. There's no nasty drag. There's no loud noises. Okay, you can hear it in the easier gears, but it's not unpleasant or intrusive. It's got quite short cranks, 165mm for foot clearance between your feet and the floor, and you can spin them nicely to make up for the fact that you don't get as much torque from a shorter crank. And perhaps that's all the rage. Perhaps that's what's going to become trendy, is shorter cranks. It's got quite a wide bar, which is aluminium, a short stem, and it's got aggressive angles. But the steep seat angle and long rear end mean it's super comfortable for seated climbing. It's not light for a trail bike, but it's certainly light enough to winch your way up a climb without it feeling at all laborious. Just like the Scott, it's got electronic gears, and these are super easy to change and shift through the gears whichever direction you want, and they're really quiet and quite intuitive. The shock has a climb lever, which I've just flicked now. It's quite far out of the way because the shock is so low down in the frame to give you a low centre of gravity. When you do flick it, you can feel it firming up the damping on the rear and transferring more of your pedalling power into going forwards. Strangely, on this bike, The mullet rear end is the same length as the 29er rear end. So they've not made it any shorter or more flickable with the smaller rear wheel. So you keep that inherent stability that this chassis has, despite the fact that the rear wheel's smaller, which is pretty clever. The rear tyre is a Maxxis Forecaster, which is a full-on trail bike spec for a tyre. It's fairly slick, it's very fast rolling, but it's the 3C, which means you get a soft compound on the shoulders to give you plenty of grip on the descent. We're getting near the top of the climb now, so it's time to turn onto the flat and then down onto a double black diamond descent. So all I need to do, bang through a couple of gears using the electronic shifter, drop the long dropper post all the way down. It's a one-up dropper on this bike. Flick the switch on the RockShox Select Plus shock, so I get full damping action on the rear, and then drop in and see how it goes. Okay, so straight away, this long back end gives you loads of stability and loads of feel. You can chuck your weight really far back. The braking performance is absolutely incredible from this upside down 4-bar on this bike. You really just slam on the anchors and it just stops his nuts. It's just helped by the 3C Maxxis tyres front and rear. Really throw it into turns. And as I say, the stability from the aggressive geometry and that rear end is fantastic. Just sending stuff that's only on a 130mm travel bike, which is bloody impressive. Okay, let's hit the jumps and see how they feel. Okay, so it's a longer rear end. It's a bit more laborious to manual. Thanks to the rearward axle path, it stays ever so stable as you go up the takeoffs. Squash this one, I'll go really far. And then yeah, manual this. The long rear end, as I say, carries bags of speed, and it's very predictable to drift actually with this long rear end. Ooh, so this thing's absolutely amazing. It's got the mullet setup, which means it's a wicked descender. The high pivot means it carries amazing speed. And yeah, I love the new 4-bar link, the upside down 4-bar on the rear. It just means that under braking, you just suddenly get on the anchors. It's a seriously capable descender, and it feels like it's got way more than 130mm travel. Let's see what the competition is like and which is more futuristic. This Scott Genius 910 ST has a carbon fibre frame with a 4-bar rear suspension design controlling the braking forces, just like the Forbidden, but it doesn't have the Druid's high pivot and idler. It costs even more than the Forbidden at £7,499 or $7,599 US. But for that, you get a one-piece carbon fibre handlebar and stem combo, along with some very clever future tech, which you don't get on the Forbidden. Looks-wise, I love the paint job, and the clean lines of the bike look super smart. In fact, I can't see a rear shock anywhere. Unlike the Druid MX, the Genius uses a larger 29-inch rear wheel for extra traction and faster rolling. But probably the biggest difference between the Genius and other trail bikes is it's got a whopping 160mm of travel on the front and 150mm of travel on the back, 10mm more than the fork on the Druid and 20mm more on the rear. This is way more travel than the Forbidden, and it's similar to many enduro bikes, which are designed for much harsher terrain than trail bikes like these. Now, let's try and find that hidden shock to uncover why Scott gave their trail bike so much suspension travel. Where on earth is it? Oh, there it is. So this is the Fox Float X nude rear shock that the Scott Genius has to give it 150mm of rear suspension travel. It allows the bike to transform into a cross-country whippet at the push of a button. Let's have a look at the button. The track lock lever adjusts the shock between 3 modes: open, ramp control and descent. In descent mode, both the damper and the air spring are fully active at maximum volume and compliance. But if you put the shock in ramp control mode, something really clever happens to the air spring. A sleeve blocks a port and reduces the volume of the air spring, reducing travel available from the large 150mm to a cross-country feeling 100mm at the switch of a lever. Push the track lock lever further and you move into climb mode. This keeps the reduced travel and additionally firms up the damping, by adding a threshold, which Scott say will improve climbing ability even further. The Genius 910 ST comes in at a similar cost to the Forbidden and the spec is comparable. Scott state that the Genius is the ultimate trail bike. However, I think we should hit the trails to see if the larger rear wheel and traditional rear suspension design, coupled with all the future tech, actually makes for a better ride than the Druid's mullet setup and high pivot design. Okay, we're aboard the futuristic Scott Genius ST910, where the ST stands for Super Trail. So it's got more travel than the normal Genius. The ST has 160 up front and 150 on the rear. And the clever trickery it's got involves the shock. So I've got this lever on the handlebar here, and when I press it once, something really clever happens. A port between two chambers is closed, reducing the volume of air inside the shock. And what that does is make it ramp up super fast. So it acts as if it's got less travel, because there's less travel that you can actually access. And then if I press it again, a damping threshold comes into play, which closes the hydraulic circuit essentially, or makes it much harder for the oil to move through the hydraulic circuit. So it really does pedal incredibly well as I start to push the pedals harder on the steeper parts of the climb. It's got a 29-inch wheel on the rear, which means over these small rocks it is rolling slightly better, and it's also got 5mm longer cranks than the Forbidden. So that also means I can put in more torque, but it's not quite so comfortable to spin my legs so fast at a high cadence. So it's definitely a compromise whether you go longer or shorter with the cranks. Weight-wise, both the bikes are very similar. This is 14.7 kilo, very similar to the Forbidden's weight, and this feels very sprightly. Doesn't feel quite as planted when seated climbing as the Forbidden does. It's quieter with no idler, and that shock does a wonderful job of just firming up the rear suspension, transferring all my power to the ground. So although it has more travel than the Forbidden, it pedals really fantastically well. And the Öhlins fork as well also has a damping threshold, so that it helps the forks not to bob on the climb. We're nearing the top of the climb now, so it's time to start preparing the bike to get into descent mode. So first, I'll flick this lever here, and that opens up the air can on the shock to allow full travel and makes the compression damping as free and open as possible. Reach down to the fork, open up the Öhlins fork so that, again, the damping is free and open. Push the button and make the dropper post drop all the way down. Click through a couple of the electronic axis gears, then ready to drop in onto the double black diamond of Cougar. Okay, off the drop. Okay, now straight away the bigger wheels are rolling faster. It's got a shorter back end, which means that I'm able to whip the bike around more, easier to pop into a manual, but not quite as stable. That rear shock tune, which is much more open and compliant, nearly lost it, than the one on the Forbidden, actually doesn't seem to carry quite as much speed when you're really cracking on. It feels nice on the climbs. On the descent, it's just, as I say, it's not quite as composed. The Forbidden's a bit more of a firm compression tune. Now this is where that short back end comes into its own. Super easy to manual. Feels really comfortable on the jump. A little windy today. Oh, I don't know how I rode out of that one. I don't know if that was the tyre moving or the wind, but yeah, that was a little sketchy. I'm alive, right, back to the bike test. Yeah, it feels lovely. Bars are a little narrower than on the Forbidden, these carbon one pieces. Whoa, okay, so a few sketchy moments on the descent there. I managed to save it, thankfully. The big 2.6 tyres work really well on the roots and the rough bits, as does the 160mm Öhlins fork, which provides loads of grip. When you're coming up the climb, it carries loads of speed, and this trick suspension system really works. It is a cliche, but it does climb like a 100mm travel bike, even though it's got 150mm rear wheel travel. It is really light for the amount of travel it's got. That helps as well, and the suspension tune helps it carry speed, although it did lose composure a few times on the descent. But which one is the future? The Scott is the most futuristic looking, and with its hidden shock, it pedals incredibly. It's super efficient at covering ground, and the high-tech gadgetry on the shock really does make it climb like a bike with much shorter travel. So if you value having a light, zippy bike, then the Scott is the bike which breaks the mold as a very speed-focused all-rounder. But I don't think it's the one which I would take home. The Forbidden isn't as futuristic as the Scott, but could it be the future of trail bikes? The suspension on the Scott isn't as descent focused as the Forbidden. It can find grip really well on rooty stuff, but on the big hits and big braking bumps, the Druid takes it for sure. So if you're after a short travel but descent focused trail bike, like me, then I think the Forbidden is the answer. When pointing it downhill, the lively mullet setup with a smaller rear wheel and bump gobbling suspension mean that this is an absolute winner when it comes to entertainment. I can't wait to spend the rest of this year riding the Forbidden, and I will be putting it through its paces, so keep an eye out for more vids. But is it the bike of the future? Well, trail builders are building more technically challenging descents than ever before, and riders are questioning how much travel they actually need. A bike like this Scott Genius ST is dynamic and nimble, as well as very capable on extreme terrain. So I think that hardcore trail bikes like this are going to set the tone for the mountain bikes of the future.